My name is Jean Morris. I'm 29 years old, and for 3 years I was imprisoned in a basement by people I trusted more than my own family. When the police finally broke down that door, I weighed 87 pounds, had bruises covering my arms, and hadn't seen sunlight in so long that the fluorescent lights in the hospital burned my eyes. The officer who found me said I looked like a ghost, but what haunts me more than the captivity itself is how easily everyone around me believed the lies they told about where I'd gone. Have you ever disappeared from your own life while everyone you knew just accepted the explanation they were given? If something like this has ever happened to you or someone you love, share it in the comments. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I need you to understand something about me before I tell you how this started. I wasn't naive. I wasn't some sheltered girl who trusted everyone. I'd been taking care of myself since I was 16, when my parents died in a car accident. I worked my way through community college, saved every penny to get my certification as a medical assistant, and by 25 I had my own apartment, a reliable job at a family practice clinic, and what I thought was a solid group of friends. I was independent, careful, maybe even a little too guarded when it came to letting people get close. That's what made what happened to me so much worse. Because I should have seen it coming. The people who destroyed my life weren't strangers who grabbed me off the street. They were Rebecca and Marcus Chen, a couple I'd known for 2 years, people I considered family, when I didn't have any left. Rebecca worked as a nurse at the same clinic, where I was a medical assistant, and Marcus owned a small construction business. They seemed like the most normal, stable people in the world. Rebecca was the one who always remembered birthdays, brought homemade cookies to work, stayed late to help with difficult patients. Marcus was quiet but kind, the type of man who fixed her car without being asked and never expected anything in return. They'd been married for 8 years, lived in a beautiful 2-story house in Millbrook Heights, and seemed to have everything figured out in a way that made me envious. I met them during my first week at the clinic, when Rebecca was assigned to train me. She was patient when I struggled with the computer system, covered for me when I made mistakes with scheduling, and gradually became the older sister I'd never had. When she found out I was spending holidays alone, she started inviting me to their house for Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, every celebration. Marcus would grill burgers in their backyard, while Rebecca and I talked about work, relationships, dreams for the future. Their house felt like the home I'd lost when my parents died, warm and safe, and filled with the kind of laughter I'd forgotten existed. Over time, I started spending more and more time there. Rebecca would call after difficult shifts and invite me over for dinner. Marcus would text me pictures of projects he was working on, asking for my opinion on colors or layouts. They included me in everything: couples game nights, weekend trips to the lake, even family gatherings with Marcus's parents. I felt like I belonged somewhere again, like I had people who cared about me, not because they had to, but because they chose to. When my lease was up for renewal and my landlord raised the rent by $300, Rebecca suggested I move in with them temporarily until I found something better. "We have that extra bedroom upstairs," she said, stirring pasta sauce at their kitchen counter while Marcus set the table. "It's just sitting empty anyway, and you could save money while you look for a place you actually want instead of settling for something you can barely afford." Marcus nodded enthusiastically, adding that they'd love the company and that I could stay as long as I needed. It felt like a gift, like the universe finally giving me the family I'd been missing. I said yes without hesitation. The first few months living with them were exactly what I'd hoped for. I had my own space upstairs, a comfortable room with a window overlooking their garden, and enough room for my furniture and books. Rebecca and I would have coffee together in the mornings before work, talking about patients we were worried about or weekend plans. Marcus would leave me little notes on the kitchen counter when he had to leave early for job sites, usually something silly like, "Don't let Rebecca drink all the coffee before I get home," or "There's leftover pizza in the fridge with your name on it, literally." I contributed to groceries and utilities, helped with housework, and felt like I was part of something real for the first time in years. But looking back now, I can see the signs I missed, the small changes that happened so gradually I didn't notice them at first. Rebecca started asking more questions about my schedule, wanting to know exactly when I'd be home from work, where I was going on my days off, who I was meeting for lunch. She framed it as caring, as wanting to make sure I was safe, and I appreciated the attention. Marcus began commenting on my appearance more often, suggesting I wear my hair down instead of up, telling me certain colors looked better on me than others. Again, it felt like kindness, like having people who noticed and cared about details. They also started subtly discouraging my friendships outside their house. When I mentioned grabbing drinks with coworkers, Rebecca would point out how expensive bars were and suggest we stay in and watch movies instead. When I talked about weekend plans with college friends, Marcus would remind me about home projects we'd discussed doing together, or mention that Rebecca had been looking forward to our usual Saturday morning farmers market trip. It never felt controlling because they always had reasonable explanations, and honestly, I preferred spending time with them anyway. They felt like family, while my other friendships felt more like obligations. The first real warning sign came about 6 months after I moved in, but I explained it away at the time. I woke up one morning feeling groggy and disoriented, like I'd taken sleeping pills even though I hadn't. Rebecca was already in the kitchen making breakfast, humming to herself, and when I mentioned feeling strange, she suggested I might be coming down with something. "You've been working so hard lately," she said, pouring me a cup of coffee. "Maybe your body is trying to tell you to slow down." I accepted the explanation because it made sense, and because the feeling passed after a few hours. But it happened again 2 weeks later, and then again after that. Always on weekends, always when I woke up in their house. I started to wonder if I was developing some kind of sleep disorder, but when I mentioned it to Dr. Patterson at work, he said my symptoms didn't match any common sleep issues and suggested I might just be stressed. Rebecca, who was standing nearby updating patient files, agreed. "Jean's been pushing herself too hard," she told him. "She needs to learn to relax." Dr. Patterson prescribed a mild anxiety medication and told me to take better care of myself. The medication didn't help because the problem wasn't anxiety. What I didn't know then was that Rebecca had been putting small amounts of sedatives in my food and drinks. Not enough to knock me out completely, but enough to make me confused and compliant. She'd learned about drug interactions and dosages during her nursing training, and she was careful to use substances that would metabolize quickly and leave minimal traces. The grogginess I felt was actually me recovering from being drugged, but I had no reason to suspect the people who claimed to love me. Around this time, they started talking more frequently about how worried they were about my mental health. Rebecca would mention to Marcus within my hearing how she'd found me crying in my room even though I hadn't been crying. Marcus would ask if I was okay because I seemed distant or anxious even when I felt perfectly fine. They started suggesting I see a therapist, offering to help me find someone and even to pay for sessions if money was tight. Their concern felt genuine, and I started to wonder if I was having problems I wasn't aware of, if the stress of my parents' deaths and years of being alone was finally catching up to me. The conversations became more frequent and more detailed. Rebecca would come home from work with stories about patients who'd had mental breakdowns, describing their symptoms in ways that sounded uncomfortably familiar. Marcus started researching treatment facilities online, showing me articles about people who'd benefited from intensive therapy programs. They painted a picture of me as someone who was struggling more than I realized. Someone who needed help but was too proud or too scared to ask for it. And because I trusted them completely, because they'd been nothing but kind and supportive, I started to believe them. The real shift happened about 9 months after I moved in. I came home from work one evening to find them both sitting at the kitchen table with serious expressions. Rebecca had clearly been crying, and Marcus looked like he was trying to hold himself together. When I asked what was wrong, they exchanged a look before Rebecca spoke. "John, we need to talk about something," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Dr. Patterson called me today about some concerns he has regarding your behavior at work." I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of concerns?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "He's noticed you've been making mistakes with patient files, forgetting conversations you've had, sometimes seeming confused about basic procedures you've known for years. He's worried about your mental state, and, honestly, so are we." I tried to protest, to explain that I hadn't noticed any of these issues, but Rebecca pulled out a small notebook where she'd apparently been documenting incidents. Dates when I'd seemed disoriented, times when I'd asked the same question twice, moments when I'd appeared to be talking to myself. Seeing it written down like that, presented as evidence of my declining mental health, was devastating. I started to doubt my own perceptions, to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality without realizing it. "We think you need professional help," Rebecca said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "Real help, from people who know how to deal with trauma and mental illness. We've been researching treatment centers, places that specialize in cases like yours." I asked what they meant by cases like mine, and Marcus explained that they believed I was suffering from delayed grief reaction, combined with possible dissociative episodes. He used medical terms he'd clearly researched, described symptoms that sounded clinical and serious. They'd spoken to a psychiatrist who'd recommended an intensive residential treatment program, somewhere I could get the help I needed without the distractions and triggers of everyday life. The treatment center they'd found was called Riverside Recovery, located about 2 hours away in a rural area where patients could focus on healing without outside interference. According to the brochures they showed me, it was a small private facility that specialized in trauma recovery and featured individual therapy, group counseling, and holistic healing approaches. The photos showed peaceful grounds, comfortable rooms, and smiling staff members. It looked like exactly the kind of place someone might go to get their life back on track. But what convinced me more than the brochures was their obvious distress. Rebecca kept crying, talking about how scared she was that I was going to hurt myself without meaning to. Marcus described finding me standing in the backyard at 3 in the morning, staring at nothing, though I had no memory of this happening. They painted a picture of someone who was deteriorating rapidly, someone who needed immediate intervention before something terrible happened. "We love you," Rebecca said through her tears. "You're like a sister to me."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
"And I can't watch you disappear like this. Please, just try the program. If it doesn't help, you can leave anytime, but at least give yourself a chance to get better." The pressure wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was loving, concerned, desperate. They made it clear that they supported whatever decision I made, but that they were terrified of what might happen if I didn't get help soon. They offered to drive me to the facility themselves, to visit every weekend, to be there for every step of my recovery. It felt like the ultimate expression of love. People willing to sacrifice their own comfort to save someone they cared about. I agreed to go, not because I fully believed I needed intensive treatment, but because I trusted them completely and couldn't bear the thought of causing them so much pain. If the people who knew me best thought I was in trouble, if a doctor I respected had expressed concerns, then maybe I was sicker than I realized. Maybe the confusion and disorientation I'd been feeling were symptoms of something serious, something that required professional intervention. The night before I was supposed to leave for Riverside Recovery, Rebecca helped me pack a suitcase with clothes and personal items. She was unusually emotional, hugging me tight and telling me how proud she was that I was taking this step. Marcus grilled my favorite dinner and we sat on their back porch talking about what I hoped to accomplish during treatment. They assured me that my job would be waiting when I returned, that my room would stay exactly as I left it, that nothing would change except that I'd be healthier and happier. I went to bed that night feeling nervous but hopeful, believing I was about to embark on a journey that would help me heal from traumas I hadn't even realized were affecting me. I trusted Rebecca and Marcus completely, never imagining that they'd been systematically destroying my perception of reality for months, preparing me to voluntarily walk into a situation where I'd have no control and no way to escape. What I didn't know was that Riverside Recovery didn't exist, at least not in the way they'd described it. What I was actually walking into was a carefully planned imprisonment, orchestrated by the two people I trusted most in the world, designed to make me disappear from my own life so completely that no one would ever think to look for me. The morning they were supposed to drive me to the treatment center, I woke up feeling more disoriented than ever before. Rebecca brought me coffee and breakfast in bed, explaining that I'd had a difficult night and that she wanted me to rest before the long drive. The coffee tasted slightly bitter, but I attributed that to my nerves about starting treatment. Within an hour, I was struggling to keep my eyes open, my thoughts becoming increasingly foggy and disconnected. "It's okay," Rebecca said, sitting beside me on the bed and stroking my hair. "You're just having some anxiety about the change. The doctor said this might happen, that your mind might try to protect itself by shutting down before treatment." Just relax. Let us take care of everything. I remember fragments of that day like pieces of a broken mirror. Marcus carrying me to their car. Rebecca explaining to someone on the phone that I was having an episode and needed immediate help. The sensation of movement and voices around me while I drifted in and out of consciousness. I trusted them even as my body was failing me, even as some deep part of my mind was screaming that something was wrong. When I finally woke up completely, I was in a basement I'd never seen before, lying on a narrow bed in a room with no windows and only one door. The walls were concrete, painted white but already showing signs of wear. There was a small bathroom in one corner, a table with a chair, and a bookshelf with a few paperback novels. A single overhead light provided harsh, constant illumination. The door was heavy metal with multiple locks on the outside. I sat up slowly, my head still fuzzy from whatever they'd given me, and tried to make sense of where I was. This wasn't Riverside Recovery. This wasn't a treatment center. This was a prison, and as that realization hit me, I heard footsteps on the stairs outside my door. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, no longer the caring friend who'd been worried about my mental health. Her expression was calm, almost businesslike, as she explained my new reality. "You're exactly where you need to be," she said. "Safe, away from all the stress and confusion of the outside world. This is your chance to focus completely on getting better, without any distractions or temptations to fall back into old patterns." I tried to stand, to push past her and get to the stairs, but my legs were still weak from the drugs. She didn't try to stop me physically, just watched as I stumbled and caught myself against the wall. "Jean, you need to understand that this is for your own good," she continued. "You were getting worse every day, making dangerous decisions, putting yourself and others at risk. We couldn't let you hurt yourself anymore." I demanded to know where I really was, what had happened to the treatment center, why I was locked in a basement instead of getting professional help. Rebecca's explanation was calm and measured, delivered like she was discussing a patient's care plan. According to her, my mental state had deteriorated so rapidly that traditional treatment wasn't an option anymore. I'd become a danger to myself and others, and this was the only way to keep me safe while we worked on finding a real solution. "The people at Riverside Recovery said they couldn't help someone in your condition," she explained. "They recommended a different approach, something more intensive and controlled. This is temporary, just until we can find a facility that specializes in cases as severe as yours." Marcus appeared behind her, carrying a tray of food and looking genuinely sad about the situation. "We know this isn't what any of us wanted," he said, setting the tray on the small table. "But we love you too much to let you destroy yourself. This is the hardest thing we've ever had to do, but it's the right thing." They had an answer for everything. When I asked about work, Rebecca said she'd already spoken to Dr. Patterson and explained that I'd had a complete mental breakdown and needed extended residential treatment. When I demanded to call someone, anyone, to explain what was really happening, Marcus gently pointed out that my delusions and paranoia were exactly why I needed to be protected from outside influences that might make my condition worse. "You think we're the enemy right now," Rebecca said, "but that's just the illness talking. When you're better, when your mind is clear again, you'll understand that we saved your life." They left me alone after that, the sound of multiple locks engaging on the other side of the door. I spent the rest of that first day alternating between rage and disbelief, pounding on the door until my hands were raw, screaming until my voice gave out, searching every inch of that room for anything that might help me escape. But the basement had been prepared specifically for holding someone against their will. The walls were solid concrete, the door was reinforced steel, and even the light fixture was recessed into the ceiling where I couldn't reach it. The worst part wasn't the physical captivity, though that was horrific enough. The worst part was the psychological warfare they waged against me every single day. The constant insistence that my imprisonment was actually treatment, that my desire for freedom was evidence of mental illness, that the people who loved me most in the world were the only ones standing between me and complete self-destruction. This was just the beginning of 3 years that would test every aspect of my will to survive. 3 years where I had to fight not just for my freedom, but for my sanity, my sense of reality, and my fundamental belief that I deserved to exist in the world above. The routine they established was designed to break down my sense of time and reality. Rebecca would come down every morning at what I guessed was around 8 o'clock, bringing breakfast and what she called my daily medication. The pills were small and white, and she insisted they were antipsychotics that would help stabilize my mood and clear my thinking. When I refused to take them, she calmly explained that my food would be reduced until I complied. After 3 days of eating nothing but small portions of bread and water, I started taking the pills. The medication made everything foggy and distant, like I was experiencing life through thick glass. My thoughts moved slowly, my emotions felt muted, and even my anger at the situation seemed manageable rather than urgent. Rebecca would sit with me during these morning visits, asking how I was feeling, whether I was having any violent thoughts, if I was ready to acknowledge that my previous beliefs about being kidnapped were actually delusions caused by my mental illness. "Recovery is a process," she would say, making notes in a small journal she always carried. "Some days will be better than others, but the important thing is that you're safe here, while your brain heals from all the trauma and stress you've been carrying." Marcus would visit in the evenings, usually bringing dinner and books or magazines he thought might help me feel more comfortable. His approach was different from Rebecca's clinical demeanor. He seemed genuinely sad about the situation, often sitting quietly with me while I ate, occasionally sharing stories about his day or asking if there was anything specific I needed to feel more at ease. He maintained the fiction that this was temporary, that they were actively looking for a proper treatment facility that could handle my case. "I know this isn't ideal," he would say, looking around the basement room with obvious discomfort, "but Rebecca's talked to 3 different specialists, and they all agreed that moving you right now could trigger a complete psychotic break. We have to be patient, let the medication work, wait until you're stable enough for transport." The isolation was crushing, but what made it unbearable was the way they twisted every natural response I had into evidence of mental illness. When I cried, Rebecca noted that I was displaying signs of depression and emotional instability. When I got angry and shouted, Marcus documented aggressive behavior that proved I wasn't ready for less restrictive treatment. When I tried to engage them in rational conversation about my legal rights or demanded to contact someone outside, they pointed to my persisting delusions and paranoid thinking as proof that the medication needed to be increased. After about 6 weeks, I realized that resistance in any traditional sense was only strengthening their narrative and worsening my conditions. So I started to play along, not completely, but enough to buy myself better treatment and more information about what they were planning. I began taking the medication without argument, engaging politely in Rebecca's daily mental health assessments, and expressing gratitude for their care and concern. The shift in my behavior seemed to please them both. Rebecca noted my improved compliance and attitude in her journal, and Marcus started bringing me small luxuries like better food, paperback novels, and even a radio that could pick up a few local stations. But more importantly, they began to relax their guard around me, speaking more freely about the outside world, and occasionally letting slip details about their broader plan. During one of these more comfortable visits, Rebecca mentioned that my absence from work had been extended indefinitely due to my severe mental health crisis. Dr. Patterson had been very understanding, she said, especially after she provided him with documentation from the psychiatric specialists who were treating me. When I asked to see this documentation, she explained that showing me medical records while I was still delusional might interfere with my treatment, but that everything was being handled properly through appropriate channels. Marcus revealed more during his evening visits, particularly when he seemed tired or stressed about work. I learned that they'd been telling people I was at a private residential facility that didn't allow outside contact during the initial treatment phase. My few remaining friendships had been managed through carefully worded text messages sent from my phone, explaining that I was focusing on my mental health and wouldn't be available for social contact while I worked through some serious personal issues. "People understand," he assured me. "Mental health is taken more seriously now than it used to be. Everyone just wants you to get better, and they're willing to give you whatever space and time you need." The most chilling revelation came about 3 months into my captivity, when Rebecca was discussing my case with someone on the phone while she thought I was sleeping. I'd learned to fake the drowsiness that came with the evening medication, and I was lying still with my eyes closed when she made a call from just outside my door. "The transition is going exactly as planned," she said in a low voice. "She's much more manageable now, fully dependent on the routine we've established. I think we can move to phase 2 within the next few months." There was a pause while the other person spoke, then Rebecca continued. "No, she doesn't suspect anything about the long-term plan. She still thinks this is temporary treatment, that we're looking for a real facility to transfer her to. She has no idea that legally she's already disappeared." My blood went cold as I realized that whatever they were doing was more elaborate and permanent than I'd understood. This wasn't just about keeping me isolated until I broke down completely. There was a larger scheme involved, something that required my legal disappearance and had multiple phases of implementation. Over the following weeks, I paid closer attention to their conversations and started piecing together fragments of their actual plan. Rebecca worked in medical records and had access to patient information, insurance databases, and official documentation systems. Marcus owned a construction business that operated under multiple LLC names and had experience with property transfers and legal paperwork. Together, they'd been using my identity and medical history to create a paper trail that supported a specific narrative about my mental health decline and eventual permanent institutionalization. The morning visits became interrogation sessions disguised as therapy, with Rebecca asking detailed questions about my childhood, my parents' death, my financial situation, and my relationships with people from my past. She claimed this information was necessary for my treatment plan, but I began to understand that she was actually mapping my entire life to ensure their story about my disappearance would hold up under scrutiny. "Tell me about your parents' insurance policies again," she would say, pen poised over her notebook. "I want to make sure we have accurate information for the specialists who will be reviewing your case." When I asked why insurance information from a decade ago was relevant to my current treatment, she explained that childhood trauma often manifested in complex ways that required comprehensive background analysis. But I noticed that her questions always circled back to financial details, legal documentation, and people who might ask questions about my whereabouts or well-being. Marcus's role became clearer during his evening visits, when he would casually mention property management issues he was dealing with at work. He talked about helping clients transfer assets when they needed long-term care, about the legal processes involved when someone became unable to manage their own affairs, about how complicated it could be to handle someone's financial obligations when they were indefinitely hospitalized for mental health reasons. "It's actually pretty common," he said one evening, apparently responding to something I'd asked about managing my rent and bills while I was in treatment. "When someone has a complete breakdown like you did, there are legal mechanisms in place to make sure their obligations are handled properly. Rebecca has power of attorney now, so she can take care of everything while you focus on getting better." I had never given Rebecca power of attorney, but when I pointed this out, Marcus explained that it had been necessary during my acute crisis period, when I was deemed incompetent to make decisions for myself. The paperwork had been filed through emergency channels with supporting documentation from medical professionals who'd assessed my condition. The realization that they'd somehow gained legal control over my life was terrifying, but it also gave me crucial information about what I was fighting against. This wasn't just physical imprisonment. They'd created a legal framework that supported my disappearance and gave them authority over my identity, my finances, and my future. Fighting back would require more than just physical escape. It would require proving that their entire narrative about my mental state was fabricated. I started paying closer attention to the medication they were giving me, trying to understand what it actually was and how it was affecting my thinking. By pretending to take the pills and then spitting them out later, I was able to have periods of clearer thinking that helped me recognize just how much the drugs had been clouding my judgment. The pills weren't antipsychotics designed to treat mental illness. They were sedatives meant to keep me compliant and confused. During my clearer moments, I began systematically examining every aspect of my captivity, looking for weaknesses in their security, patterns in their behavior, and opportunities to gather evidence of what they were doing. The basement room had been carefully prepared to hold someone long-term, but it wasn't a professional facility. There were signs of hasty construction, areas where the soundproofing was incomplete, and small details that suggested this setup had been improvised rather than designed by experts. The door was the strongest element of my prison, with multiple heavy-duty locks that would be impossible to defeat without tools. But the walls, while solid concrete, showed signs of recent work. In one corner, I could see where new drywall had been installed, probably to cover utility lines or create additional soundproofing. The bathroom plumbing was clearly an addition, with newer pipes that didn't match the rest of the basement's infrastructure. Most importantly, I discovered that the ceiling above my bed had a small access panel that had been painted over but not properly sealed. By standing on the chair and pressing firmly, I could tell that the panel was loose and might provide access to the space between floors. I couldn't explore immediately because of their regular visits, but I began planning how I might use this potential escape route. The radio Marcus had brought me became my most valuable tool for understanding the outside world and tracking time. By keeping the volume low and hiding it under my mattress during visits, I was able to maintain contact with reality beyond the basement. The local news helped me understand that no one was looking for me, that whatever story Rebecca and Marcus had created about my disappearance was convincing enough to prevent any official search efforts. More crucially, the radio allowed me to begin documenting my captivity in real time. During morning visits, I would note the time and date based on news broadcasts, keeping track of Rebecca's statements about my condition and treatment in a mental log that I could maintain even while pretending to be medicated. I memorized details about their conversations, their schedules, and their plans that might later serve as evidence of their crimes. About 5 months into my imprisonment, Rebecca's approach to my case changed in a way that suggested they were moving toward whatever Phase 2 entailed. Instead of focusing on my supposed mental illness, she began discussing long-term care options and the challenges of finding appropriate placement for someone with my specific combination of conditions. "The specialists have been very clear about your prognosis," she said during one morning visit, her tone more clinical than it had been in months. "The damage from your psychotic breaks appears to be permanent, which means traditional outpatient treatment isn't going to be sufficient. We need to start thinking about facilities that can provide lifelong care and supervision." When I asked what she meant by lifelong care, she explained that my condition had progressed to a point where independent living would never again be safe or feasible. The delusions and violent tendencies I'd displayed, combined with my inability to maintain consistent reality testing, meant that I would require permanent institutional support. The good news, she said, was that there were excellent long-term facilities available for people with my diagnosis. "I've been in contact with a place called Meadowbrook Extended Care," she continued, showing me a brochure for what appeared to be a legitimate residential facility for adults with severe mental illness. "They specialize in cases like yours, people who need structure and support but aren't necessarily dangerous enough for maximum security psychiatric hospitals. It's actually quite nice, more like a group home than an institution." The brochure looked professional and convincing, with photos of comfortable common areas, private rooms, and outdoor spaces where residents could spend time safely supervised. But after months of their deception, I no longer trusted anything they showed me. I suspected that Meadowbrook Extended Care was either another fiction or a real place where they planned to deposit me using falsified medical records and legal documentation. Marcus confirmed my suspicions during his next visit when he mentioned that the transfer to Meadowbrook would happen within the next few months, once the final paperwork was processed and my condition had stabilized sufficiently for transport. He seemed genuinely relieved about this development, as if my permanent institutionalization would finally resolve a difficult situation he'd been managing against his better judgment. "I know this isn't what you wanted," he said, sitting beside my bed with his usual expression of regretful concern. "But Rebecca says the doctors are confident that Meadowbrook will be a good fit for your needs. You'll have your own room, structured activities, people trained to help with your specific challenges. It's really the best possible outcome given everything that's happened." The timeline they were suggesting gave me perhaps 2 months to either escape or find a way to expose what they were doing before they moved me to a location where rescue would be much more difficult. A legitimate long-term care facility would have professional staff, security protocols, and oversight that would make it nearly impossible for me to convince anyone that I was being held against my will. Once I was officially committed as a severely mentally ill patient who required permanent supervision, proving my sanity and competence would become exponentially more challenging. I realized that my window for action was closing rapidly, and that whatever I was going to do would have to happen soon. But I also understood that any escape attempt would need to be carefully planned and perfectly executed, because failure would only provide them with additional evidence of my dangerous instability, and justify even more restrictive measures. The breakthrough I needed came from an unexpected source. During one of Rebecca's morning visits, she received a phone call that seemed to agitate her significantly. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but her responses suggested that someone was asking questions about my case or my whereabouts that she hadn't anticipated. "No, she's not available for visitors right now," Rebecca said, her voice tighter than usual. "The treatment protocol specifically prohibits outside contact during this phase. I understand your concern, but the specialists have been very clear about maintaining environmental stability. I can pass along a message, but I can't guarantee when she'll be able to respond." After she hung up, Rebecca seemed distracted and worried in a way I hadn't seen before. When I asked if everything was okay, she brushed off my concern but mentioned that sometimes people from my past tried to interfere with my treatment without understanding the complexity of my condition. "Someone from your old job called the clinic asking about you," she said, making notes in her journal with more force than necessary. "Apparently they wanted to send flowers or a card, but I had to explain that external stimuli can be very disruptive during intensive treatment phases. The fact that someone from my workplace was asking about me was the first indication I'd had that my disappearance might not be as seamlessly managed as Rebecca and Marcus believed. If Dr. Patterson or one of my former coworkers was starting to ask questions, it meant there might be cracks in their carefully constructed narrative that I could potentially exploit. Over the next few days, I paid careful attention to any signs that their control over the situation was less complete than they'd claimed. Rebecca seemed more tense during her visits, checking her phone frequently and occasionally cutting our sessions short to make phone calls from upstairs. Marcus mentioned having to handle some unexpected paperwork related to my case, and he seemed less confident about the timeline for my transfer to Meadowbrook. The opportunity I'd been waiting for came during a particularly stressful week, when both Rebecca and Marcus seemed overwhelmed by whatever complications had arisen in managing my disappearance. Rebecca's morning visit was shorter than usual, and she forgot to wait and watch while I took my medication. For the first time in months, I was able to avoid taking the pills without having to hide them and spit them out later. That evening, Marcus seemed especially tired when he brought my dinner. Instead of his usual careful attention to locking the door behind him, he engaged the locks quickly and didn't double-check them the way he normally did. After he left, I tested the door and discovered that one of the 3 locks hadn't caught properly, leaving only 2 securing mechanisms holding the door closed. The partial unlocking of the door, combined with my clearer thinking from missing the morning medication, gave me the best chance I'd had since my captivity began. But I also knew that I might not get another opportunity like this, and that whatever I did would have to succeed completely because there wouldn't be a second chance. I spent the night planning my approach, weighing the risks of immediate escape against the possibility of gathering evidence that would prevent them from simply recapturing me and moving me to a more secure location. By morning, I decided on a strategy that was dangerous but offered the best chance of exposing their crimes and ensuring my permanent freedom. The plan required perfect timing, complete commitment, and a level of physical and mental strength I wasn't sure I still possessed after months of imprisonment and forced medication. But as I listened to Rebecca's footsteps approaching my door for what I hoped would be the last time, I knew that I was ready to fight for my life in a way that would determine whether I lived as a free person or disappeared forever into the system they'd created to erase me. When Rebecca entered my room that morning, I was sitting on the edge of my bed with my hands folded in my lap, the picture of a compliant patient waiting for her daily medication. She seemed more relaxed than she'd been in recent days, perhaps believing that whatever complications had been causing her stress were finally under control. She set the breakfast tray on my table and pulled out the small white pills that had been clouding my thinking for months. "How are you feeling today, Jean?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me with her ever-present notebook. "Any unusual thoughts or feelings I should know about?" I gave her the response she expected, describing a restful night and expressing gratitude for her continued care. She made her notes with satisfaction, clearly pleased by my continued cooperation and stability. When she handed me the pills and the small cup of water, I took them without hesitation, placing them in my mouth and swallowing while she watched. What Rebecca didn't know was that I'd spent weeks practicing a technique I'd read about in one of the books Marcus had brought me, learning to hold pills under my tongue and swallow only the water. The skill had taken time to master without choking or appearing suspicious, but it was crucial for maintaining the clear thinking I'd need for what came next. After she finished her assessment and headed toward the door, I waited for the familiar sound of all three locks engaging. When I heard only two distinct clicks, I knew that my observation from the previous evening had been correct. Marcus had failed to properly secure one of the locks, and Rebecca had just made the same mistake. For the first time in months, only two barriers stood between me and the stairs, leading to the main floor of their house. I waited until I was certain Rebecca had gone upstairs, and resumed her normal morning routine before moving to the loose ceiling panel I'd discovered weeks earlier. Standing on the chair, I pressed firmly against the painted-over access point until it shifted enough for me to work my fingers around the edges. The panel came away easier than I'd expected, revealing a cramped space between the basement ceiling and the main floor that was filled with heating ducts, electrical conduits, and enough room for me to crawl if I was careful. The space was dark and dusty, but I could see daylight filtering through small gaps where the main floor met the exterior walls. More importantly, I could hear Rebecca moving around in the kitchen directly above me, talking on her phone about scheduling issues and patient consultations. Her voice was clear enough that I realized sound traveled both ways through this space, which meant I might be able to gather evidence of their crimes if I could position myself correctly. I pulled myself up into the crawl space, replacing the ceiling panel behind me as best I could while lying on my stomach among the ductwork. The position was uncomfortable and the space was barely large enough for my body, but I could move slowly toward different areas of the house by following the main heating ducts. My immediate goal was to reach a position where I could hear and potentially record conversations that would prove what Rebecca and Marcus had been doing. The first conversation I overheard confirmed my worst suspicions about their timeline and methods. Rebecca was speaking to someone who was clearly involved in their scheme, discussing final preparations for my transfer to what she called the permanent facility. The conversation wasn't about Meadowbrook Extended Care, the place they'd been describing to me, but about a private institution that operated outside normal oversight channels. "The patient has reached optimal compliance levels," Rebecca said in her professional voice. "We can proceed with the final placement as early as next week. All documentation has been prepared and submitted through the appropriate channels, and her legal status has been fully transferred to conservatorship management." The person on the other end must have asked about potential complications, because Rebecca's next response addressed the concerns that had been troubling her recently. There was some minor inquiries from her former workplace, but those have been resolved through proper medical privacy protocols. No one has legal standing to demand information about her condition or treatment, and her emergency contacts have been updated to reflect her current care team. I realized as I listened that Rebecca was speaking to someone at a real facility, but not the kind of place she'd been describing to me. This was an arrangement to have me committed permanently to an institution where I would disappear completely from any system that might track or protect me. The conservatorship she mentioned meant they'd gained complete legal control over my life, my identity, and my future, using falsified medical records and fraudulent psychiatric evaluations. The conversation continued with Rebecca discussing financial arrangements that made it clear this wasn't about my medical care, but about something much more profitable and sinister. "The insurance transfers are already in process, and the property management has been finalized through the business LLC. Once she's placed, all assets will be available for liquidation, according to the care cost projections we discussed." My parents had left me a small inheritance that I'd barely touched, keeping most of it in savings while I worked and lived modestly. I also had a life insurance policy through my job, and a small retirement account that had been growing steadily. Rebecca and Marcus hadn't just been planning to make me disappear. They'd been positioning themselves to profit from my absence by gaining control of everything I owned and using my commitment to a private facility as justification for liquidating my assets to pay for my care. The scope of their fraud was staggering. They'd essentially stolen my identity, my freedom, my sanity, and now my financial future, all while maintaining the facade of concerned friends who were trying to help me through a mental health crisis. The documentation Rebecca mentioned had probably been created using her access to medical systems and Marcus's experience with legal paperwork, building a completely false but officially convincing record of my mental decline and need for permanent institutional care. As I listened to more of their conversation, I understood that this wasn't their first time orchestrating this kind of scheme. Rebecca mentioned previous cases and established protocols that suggested they'd done this before, possibly multiple times, using their professional access and personal relationships to identify vulnerable targets and systematically destroy their lives for profit. The realization that I was probably not their only victim filled me with a rage that overcame the fear and despair I'd been carrying for months. Other people had suffered what I was suffering, had disappeared into the system Rebecca and Marcus had created, had lost everything while their captors prospered from their misery. I wasn't just fighting for my own freedom anymore. I was fighting to expose a criminal operation that had likely destroyed multiple lives. I remained in the crawlspace for hours, moving carefully between different positions to eavesdrop on their activities and gather as much information as possible about their methods and timeline. Marcus returned home around midday, and I was able to hear their discussion about the final phase of their plan and the specific arrangements they'd made for my permanent disposal. "The transport is scheduled for Thursday morning," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the thin flooring. "Private medical transport, 2 attendants, full sedation protocol for the transfer. Once she's signed in at Willowbrook, the paperwork becomes their responsibility, and we're clear of any ongoing liability." Willowbrook, not Meadowbrook. Even the name of the facility they'd been telling me about was a lie, designed to make me compliant while they arranged for my real destination. I made note of every detail they discussed, memorizing names, dates, locations, and procedures that could later serve as evidence of their crimes. Rebecca's response revealed the financial motivations behind their elaborate scheme. "The conservatorship transfers should be complete by the end of the month, which means we can begin asset liquidation immediately after placement. The house sale alone should cover our expenses for the next 2 years, and the insurance policies will provide ongoing revenue for at least 5 years after that." They were discussing my life like a business transaction, calculating the profit they'd make from my disappearance, and planning how to enjoy the money they'd stolen from me. The casual nature of their conversation, the way they discussed my permanent imprisonment as a successful conclusion to a profitable venture, made it clear that they felt completely safe from any consequences for their actions. But their confidence was also their weakness. They'd become careless in their communications, discussing sensitive details in ways that could be documented and used against them. If I could find a way to record their conversations or gather physical evidence of their fraud, I might be able to expose their crimes before they could complete my transfer to Willowbrook. The opportunity came when Rebecca left the house to run errands, leaving Marcus alone to handle some business calls related to his construction company. I heard him unlock the basement door and walk downstairs, probably to check on me and ensure I was still securely contained. When he discovered that my room was empty, his reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. Instead of immediately calling Rebecca or searching the house systematically, Marcus panicked. I could hear him running back upstairs, shouting my name and frantically calling Rebecca's phone. His panic made him careless, and instead of securing the house and calling for help, he focused on trying to locate me quickly before Rebecca returned and discovered his security failure. While Marcus searched the main floor and basement, calling my name and checking closets and storage areas, I carefully made my way through the crawl space toward what I hoped was the area above their home office. If they kept records of their scheme, documentation of the fraudulent medical records, and legal papers they'd created, this would be the most likely location. The office space was directly above their living room, and I could see through gaps in the flooring down into a room that was clearly set up for managing paperwork and files. There were multiple filing cabinets, a large desk with 2 computers, and what appeared to be a small safe or lockbox in one corner. More importantly, I could see that Marcus had left one of the computers active, with several documents open on the screen. The flooring in this area was older and less secure than in other parts of the house, with wider gaps between boards that allowed me to see clearly into the room below. By positioning myself carefully and using my phone's camera, which I'd managed to conceal throughout my captivity, I was able to photograph several documents that were visible on the computer screen. The documents confirmed everything I'd suspected about their methods and scope. There were template forms for psychiatric evaluations, conservatorship applications, and medical history reports that could be customized for different victims. I could see my own name on several forms, along with fabricated psychiatric diagnoses, false medical history, and forged doctor signatures that had been used to create my official mental health record. More damaging were the financial documents that showed the full extent of their theft. They'd already gained access to my bank accounts, transferred my savings to accounts they controlled, and begun the process of liquidating my assets under the authority of the fraudulent conservatorship. The timeline showed that my financial destruction had begun months before my physical captivity, suggesting they'd been planning this scheme for much longer than I'd realized. While I was photographing these documents, I heard Marcus's search become more desperate and disorganized. He was calling Rebecca repeatedly, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails about my disappearance and their need to find me before anyone else discovered what had happened. His panic was creating exactly the kind of evidence I needed to prove that my captivity wasn't voluntary medical treatment but criminal imprisonment. I managed to record several of his phone calls using my concealed phone, capturing his admissions that they'd been holding me against my will and his concerns about criminal liability if their scheme was discovered. In his panic, Marcus said things he would never have admitted under normal circumstances, providing clear evidence of kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy. "She's gone, Rebecca. The room is empty, the locks were secure. I don't know how she got out. We need to find her before she talks to anyone, or this whole thing falls apart. If she reaches the police, or calls anyone who knows her, we're looking at federal charges for everything we've done." The recording captured his confession to multiple serious crimes and his acknowledgement that my captivity had been unlawful. Combined with the photographs of their fraudulent documents and the evidence I'd gathered about their financial theft, I finally had the proof I needed to expose their operation and ensure my own protection. But I also knew that my window for action was rapidly closing. Rebecca would return soon, and once they both realized I'd escaped, they would either flee immediately or attempt to recapture me before I could reach help. I needed to get out of the house and contact authorities while I still had the element of surprise, and before they could destroy the evidence I'd discovered. The challenge was getting from the crawl space to an exit without being detected by Marcus, who was still searching the house frantically. I could hear him moving between rooms, checking windows and doors, and occasionally calling my name in a voice that had shifted from concerned to threatening. He was no longer pretending to be a caring friend helping a mentally ill person. He was a criminal trying to recapture an escaped victim. I made my way through the crawl space toward what I hoped was an area above the garage, where I might be able to access an exterior exit without going through the main house. The route required crawling over heating ducts and around electrical conduits, and the space became increasingly cramped as I moved away from the central area of the house. The garage access proved to be more challenging than I'd anticipated. The gap between floors was smaller in this area, and there was no clear way down into the garage without dropping through the ceiling. But I could see that there was a small window in the garage wall that appeared to be unlocked, and if I could reach it, I might be able to escape without alerting Marcus to my location. The drop from the crawl space to the garage floor was about 8 feet, far enough to cause serious injury if I landed wrong, but manageable if I could find a way to lower myself gradually. Using electrical conduits as handholds, I was able to work my way down until I was hanging by my hands with my feet about 4 feet from the floor. When I let go, I landed hard but managed to avoid serious injury. The impact made more noise than I'd hoped, but Marcus seemed to be searching the upstairs area and didn't immediately respond to the sound. I moved quickly to the garage window, which was indeed unlocked, and managed to open it enough to squeeze through to the outside. Emerging into daylight after months of basement captivity was overwhelming. The sun seemed impossibly bright, the air felt thin and cold, and I had to steady myself against the side of the house while my eyes adjusted and my body remembered how to function in the outside world. But I was free, truly free, for the first time since Rebecca and Marcus had tricked me into their trap. My first priority was reaching someone who could help me and getting far enough away from the house that they couldn't recapture me if they discovered my escape route. The neighborhood was quiet, with most people apparently at work during the midday hours, but I could see a house across the street where an elderly woman was working in her garden. I approached her cautiously, knowing that my appearance after months of captivity probably made me look exactly like the mentally ill, dangerous person Rebecca and Marcus had been describing to people. I was thin, pale, and wearing clothes that no longer fit properly, and I probably looked desperate and unstable in ways that might alarm a stranger. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable despite my desperation. "I need to use a phone to call the police. I've been held prisoner in that house for months, and I need help." The woman, whose name I later learned was Helen Reeves, looked at me with immediate concern rather than fear. Instead of dismissing my claims or suggesting I might be confused, she took one look at my condition and said, "Come inside right now, honey. Let's get you safe and call for help." Helen's quick acceptance of my story and immediate willingness to help probably saved my life. She brought me into her kitchen, gave me water and food, and called 911 while I tried to explain what had happened to me. Her calm, supportive response gave me the stability I needed to coherently describe my situation to the emergency dispatcher. "I need police and paramedics," Helen told the 911 operator. "I have a young woman here who says she's been held captive for months in the house across the street. She's in bad shape and needs immediate help." While we waited for emergency responders, Helen helped me organize my thoughts and prepare to explain my situation to the police. She understood immediately that this wasn't a mental health crisis or a domestic dispute, but a serious crime that required immediate law enforcement intervention. Her validation of my experience after months of being told I was delusional was incredibly healing. The police arrived within minutes, followed by paramedics and additional law enforcement personnel. The officers who responded took my story seriously from the beginning, particularly after seeing my physical condition and hearing the detailed account I was able to provide about my captivity and the evidence I'd gathered. Detective Sarah Martinez, who became the lead investigator on my case, was especially thorough in documenting my testimony and the evidence I'd collected. I was able to show her the photographs I'd taken of the fraudulent documents, play the recordings of Marcus's panicked phone calls, and provide specific details about Rebecca and Marcus's backgrounds and methods that could be verified independently. "This is clearly a complex criminal operation," Detective Martinez said after reviewing my evidence. "We're going to need to move quickly to secure the scene and arrest the suspects before they can destroy evidence or flee." While I was being examined by paramedics and giving my detailed statement, police units surrounded the house where I'd been held captive. Marcus was still inside, apparently still searching for me, when officers entered and placed him under arrest. Rebecca was arrested at her workplace, taken into custody while she was seeing patients at the medical clinic where we'd both worked. The search of their house and property revealed the full extent of their criminal operation. The basement room where I'd been held was photographed and processed as a crime scene, with evidence of long-term imprisonment and the systematic drugging they'd used to keep me compliant. The Home Office contained extensive files documenting not only their scheme against me, but similar operations they'd conducted against at least 3 other victims over the past 5 years. The other victims had been people in vulnerable situations, individuals without strong family connections or support systems who could be isolated and manipulated without triggering immediate searches or investigations. 2 of them had been successfully committed to private facilities using fraudulent documentation, where they remained imprisoned under false identities and psychiatric diagnoses. The third had died while in Rebecca and Marcus's custody, officially from complications related to mental illness, but actually from an overdose of the sedatives they'd been using for control. The financial records revealed that Rebecca and Marcus had stolen over $400,000 from their victims through conservatorship fraud, asset liquidation, and insurance manipulation. They'd been operating their scheme for years, using Rebecca's medical access and Marcus's business connections to create a pipeline for identifying, capturing, and exploiting vulnerable people. My escape had not only freed me but had exposed a criminal enterprise that had destroyed multiple lives and would have continued indefinitely if I hadn't found a way to gather evidence and reach help. The case became a federal investigation due to the interstate nature of some of their crimes and the use of fraudulent medical documents across state lines. Rebecca and Marcus were both charged with kidnapping, fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and, in the case of their victim who had died, criminally negligent homicide. The evidence I'd gathered, combined with the extensive documentation police found in their home, provided prosecutors with an overwhelming case that resulted in plea agreements for both defendants. Rebecca was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to her role in the conspiracy. Her medical license was permanently revoked, and she was ordered to pay restitution to all victims. Marcus received a 12-year sentence and was required to liquidate all business assets to contribute to victim compensation. The 2 victims who were still alive in private facilities were located and freed, though both required extensive medical and psychological treatment to recover from years of unnecessary institutionalization and medication. One had been declared legally dead by their family after disappearing, and had to go through complex legal processes to reclaim their identity and reconnect with their life. My own recovery was slow and difficult, involving months of physical rehabilitation to overcome the effects of long-term imprisonment and forced medication, as well as extensive therapy to process the trauma of systematic psychological abuse. The financial theft was largely reversible, since authorities were able to trace and recover most of my assets before they could be permanently liquidated. But the most challenging aspect of recovery was learning to trust my own perceptions again, after months of being told that my understanding of reality was fundamentally flawed. Rebecca and Marcus had been skilled at psychological manipulation, and untangling their lies from truth required professional help and a lot of time. The legal proceedings provided some closure, but also revealed how easily vulnerable people could be targeted by criminals who understood how to exploit medical and legal systems. My case led to changes in oversight procedures for conservatorship applications and stricter verification requirements for psychiatric evaluations used in commitment proceedings. I eventually returned to work in healthcare, though in a different capacity and location than before my captivity. The experience had given me insight into the vulnerability of patients and the importance of protecting people who might not be able to advocate for themselves. I became involved in victim advocacy and worked with law enforcement to help identify and prevent similar crimes. The house where I'd been imprisoned was sold, with the proceeds contributing to victim restitution. Helen Reeves, the neighbor who had helped me reach safety, became a close friend and an important part of my recovery process. Her willingness to believe my story and act immediately to help me had been crucial to my survival and the eventual exposure of Rebecca and Marcus's crimes. Looking back, I understand that my escape was possible only because of a combination of careful planning, lucky circumstances, and the mistakes my captors made due to their overconfidence. If Marcus hadn't failed to properly lock my door, if Rebecca hadn't become careless in her communications, if I hadn't found the loose ceiling panel, the outcome could have been very different. But I also recognize that my survival was ultimately due to my refusal to accept their version of reality, even when accepting it would have been easier than fighting for the truth. They tried to convince me that my imprisonment was treatment, that my desire for freedom was mental illness, that the people who claimed to love me knew better than I did what I needed. The truth was that no one has the right to steal another person's life, regardless of their justifications or methods. Rebecca and Marcus had convinced themselves that their victims were somehow better off under their control, that they were providing care rather than committing crimes. But imprisonment is imprisonment, regardless of how it's disguised or justified. My story had a resolution that many similar cases don't have. I was able to escape, gather evidence, expose my captors, and recover most of what they'd stolen from me. But I know that other people in similar situations might not be as fortunate, and that criminals like Rebecca and Marcus continue to operate by exploiting the trust and vulnerability of people who have no reason to suspect that the people closest to them might be their greatest threat. The experience taught me that survival sometimes requires questioning everything you've been told to believe, even when that questioning puts you at risk. It requires maintaining faith in your own perceptions when everyone around you insists that those perceptions are wrong. And it requires the courage to act on that faith, even when the consequences of being wrong could be catastrophic. I never found out exactly how Rebecca and Marcus first identified me as a potential victim, whether my isolation after my parents' death made me an obvious target, or whether they'd been observing and planning for longer than I realized. But I learned that predators are often skilled at identifying and cultivating relationships with people who have few advocates and limited support systems. The most important lesson from my experience is that trust must be earned continually, not just granted once and maintained indefinitely. The people who are closest to us, who have the most access to our lives and vulnerabilities, are also the people who could cause us the most harm if their intentions are not what they appear to be. Recovery from psychological manipulation requires rebuilding the ability to trust your own judgment, while also learning to evaluate other people's motives and actions more carefully. It's a delicate balance between paranoia and naivete, between reasonable caution and the openness necessary for healthy relationships. Today, I live independently again, though with security measures and support systems I didn't think I needed before my captivity. I maintain regular contact with people who would notice if I disappeared, and I've learned to pay attention to red flags in relationships that I might have dismissed before. The basement where I was held for 3 years no longer exists. The new owners of the house renovated completely, removing all traces of the prison Rebecca and Marcus had created. But the memory of those months, and the knowledge of how easily someone's life can be stolen by people they trust, continues to influence how I navigate the world and protect myself from future harm. The case against Rebecca and Marcus became a model for how law enforcement investigates and prosecutes cases involving long-term captivity and identity theft. The evidence-gathering techniques I'd used while imprisoned became part of training materials for other potential victims, and the legal precedents established by their prosecution strengthened protections for vulnerable adults. But beyond the legal and procedural impacts, my story became a reminder that disappearing from your own life doesn't always involve dramatic kidnappings or obvious violence. Sometimes it happens gradually, through manipulation and trust, by people who seem to care about you but actually see you as an opportunity for profit or control. The neighbor who called 911, Helen Reeves, later told reporters that she'd noticed Rebecca and Marcus's story about my mental health treatment didn't quite make sense, but that she'd never imagined the truth was as sinister as it turned out to be. Her willingness to trust my account of what had happened, despite my appearance and obvious distress, demonstrated the importance of believing people who ask for help, even when their stories seem unlikely. My case also highlighted the vulnerabilities in systems designed to protect people with mental illness, showing how those same systems could be exploited by criminals to legitimize their abuse and theft. The reforms that followed my case strengthened oversight and verification procedures, making it more difficult for people like Rebecca and Marcus to manipulate medical and legal systems for criminal purposes. Recovery from systematic abuse and manipulation is an ongoing process, not a destination. There are still days when I question my own perceptions or feel anxiety about trusting new people in my life. But I've learned that survival requires both vigilance and the willingness to remain open to genuine relationships and experiences. The 3 years I spent in that basement were stolen from me, and I can never get that time back. But exposing Rebecca and Marcus's crimes prevented them from stealing years from other potential victims, and the changes that resulted from my case will hopefully protect other vulnerable people from similar exploitation. The most powerful outcome of my experience has been the recognition that survival sometimes requires incredible courage, not just in the moment of escape, but in the daily choice to keep fighting for truth and freedom, even when everything around you suggests that resistance is futile. That courage can't be taught or given to someone. It has to be found within yourself when you need it most. The months following my rescue brought revelations that shook me even more than the original discovery of Rebecca and Marcus's crimes. As the federal investigation deepened, Detective Martinez called me to her office to discuss findings that would change everything I thought I understood about how I'd been targeted and why. "Jane, we need to talk about something that's going to be difficult to hear," she said, sliding a thick file across her desk toward me. "The investigation has uncovered information about how Rebecca and Marcus first identified you as a potential victim, and it goes back much further than we initially thought." I opened the file to find photographs, documents, and surveillance records that painted a picture of systematic stalking that had begun almost immediately after my parents' death. Rebecca hadn't met me by chance when I started working at the clinic. She had specifically sought employment there after identifying me as a target, using her medical credentials to gain access to my workplace and personal information. The documentation showed that Rebecca had been researching potential victims for months before approaching me, using databases and public records to identify people who fit their victim profile. She had looked for individuals who were isolated, financially stable, and psychologically vulnerable due to recent trauma or loss. My parents' obituary, which mentioned that I was their only surviving child and worked in healthcare, had apparently been what first brought me to their attention. They weren't opportunistic criminals who stumbled onto a scheme, Detective Martinez explained. This was a highly organized operation with specific targeting criteria and long-term planning phases. Rebecca spent 6 months studying your background, your work history, your financial situation, and your social connections before she ever applied for a job at your clinic. The file contained copies of my medical records that Rebecca had accessed illegally during her employment, financial information she'd gathered through pretexts and social engineering, and even photographs of me taken without my knowledge over the course of several months. They'd been building a comprehensive profile of my life my vulnerabilities, and my potential value as a victim long before I considered them friends. More disturbing was the discovery that I hadn't been their first choice. The file revealed that they'd initially targeted another woman, a nurse named Patricia Kelman, who worked at a different clinic and had lost her husband in an accident 6 months before my parents died. They'd made initial contact with Patricia and begun the early stages of their manipulation process, but she'd moved out of state to live with her sister before they could complete their plan. Patricia Kelman's move probably saved her life, Detective Martinez said. But it also meant that Rebecca and Marcus had to find a new target quickly, because they'd already invested significant time and resources into their operation. That's when they shifted their focus to you. Reading about how systematically I'd been selected and studied made me understand that everything about my relationship with Rebecca and Marcus had been calculated and false from the very beginning. The kindness Rebecca had shown during my training, the invitations to their home, the gradual integration into their social circle, even Marcus's apparent shyness and gentle nature had all been performance designed to make me trust them completely. The investigation had also uncovered the broader network that supported their crimes. Rebecca and Marcus weren't working alone. They were part of a larger organization that provided resources, documentation, and expertise for multiple fraud operations across several states. The private facility where they'd planned to have me permanently committed was owned and operated by this same criminal network, which explained why they'd been so confident that I would disappear completely once I was transferred there. We're looking at a sophisticated criminal enterprise, Detective Martinez continued, with operations in at least 6 states and possibly dozens of victims over the past decade. Rebecca and Marcus were essentially franchisees in a larger system that specializes in identity theft, conservatorship fraud, and human trafficking disguised as mental health treatment. The scope of the organization was staggering. They had corrupt medical professionals who created fraudulent psychiatric evaluations, lawyers who processed illegal conservatorship applications, private security personnel who handled victim transport, and facility operators who maintained the institutions where victims were permanently housed. The entire system was designed to make people disappear legally, using legitimate medical and legal processes that had been corrupted for criminal purposes. My case had inadvertently exposed this entire network because I'd been able to gather evidence and escape before the final transfer phase. Most other victims never had that opportunity. They were moved directly from the initial captivity phase to permanent institutionalization, without any chance to document what was happening to them or contact the outside world. The other victims we've identified, Detective Martinez explained, were all transferred to facilities within 48 hours of their initial capture. You were held for months because Rebecca wanted to perfect her techniques and because Marcus was hesitant about the permanent phase. That hesitation, which they probably saw as a weakness in their operation, is what ultimately allowed you to expose them. The federal investigation had resulted in arrests across multiple states, with coordination between FBI field offices to simultaneously raid facilities and arrest conspirators. The private institution where I would have been sent was raided the same day Rebecca and Marcus were arrested, leading to the liberation of 17 people who had been held there under false identities and fraudulent commitments. Some of these victims had been imprisoned for over 5 years, during which time their families had been told they were dead or had disappeared voluntarily. The psychological damage from years of unnecessary medication and institutional abuse was severe, and several victims required intensive medical intervention just to survive the withdrawal from drugs they'd been given to keep them compliant. One of the victims we found had been reported missing by her family 4 years ago, Detective Martinez told me. Her sister had been searching for her, hiring private investigators, offering rewards, never giving up hope. When we called to tell her we'd found her sister alive, she collapsed. She'd been planning a memorial service for next month. The stories of other victims made me realize how fortunate I'd been, not just to escape, but to have maintained my mental clarity and sense of identity throughout my captivity. Many of the people rescued from the facilities had lost significant portions of their memories due to prolonged drugging and psychological abuse. Some couldn't remember their real names or recognize family members who came to reunite with them. The financial investigation revealed that the criminal organization had stolen over $12 million from victims over the past decade, using conservatorship fraud to gain legal control of assets and then liquidating everything through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts. Most of this money was never recovered, leaving many victims financially destroyed even after their physical liberation. My involvement in exposing the organization led to invitations to testify before Congress about vulnerabilities in the conservatorship system and the need for stronger oversight of private mental health facilities. The testimony was difficult, requiring me to relive my captivity in detail, but it resulted in federal legislation that significantly strengthened protections for vulnerable adults. The Jean Morris Protection Act, as it came to be known, required independent oversight for all conservatorship applications, mandatory verification of psychiatric evaluations by multiple practitioners, and regular auditing of private facilities that housed committed patients. The law also established a federal database for tracking missing persons who might have been victims of similar schemes. But beyond the legislative and law enforcement impacts, my case attracted significant media attention that brought both opportunities and challenges. I was contacted by journalists, documentary filmmakers, and book publishers who wanted to tell my story. But I was also approached by conspiracy theorists and exploitation filmmakers who wanted to sensationalize my experience for entertainment. Working with Detective Martinez and victim advocates, I eventually agreed to participate in a documentary that focused on the systemic issues my case had exposed, rather than the sensational details of my captivity. The documentary Disappeared in Plain Sight won several awards and helped educate the public about how predators could exploit legal and medical systems to harm vulnerable people. The media attention also connected me with other survivors of similar crimes, people who had escaped from or been rescued from various forms of institutional abuse and fraud. These connections became an important part of my recovery process, providing me with a community of people who understood the unique challenges of rebuilding life after systematic deception and abuse. One of these connections was with Dr. Elizabeth Warren, not the politician but a psychologist who specialized in treating survivors of psychological manipulation and false imprisonment. Dr. Warren had developed innovative therapy techniques specifically for people who had been subjected to long-term gaslighting and reality distortion, and her treatment became crucial to my recovery. The most damaging aspect of what you experienced, Dr. Warren explained during one of our sessions, wasn't the physical captivity, but the systematic attack on your perception of reality. Rebecca and Marcus didn't just imprison your body, they tried to imprison your mind by making you doubt your own thoughts, feelings, and memories. The therapy process involved gradually rebuilding my confidence in my own perceptions, while also learning to identify and resist manipulation techniques that might be used against me in the future. Dr. Warren taught me about the psychology of predators, how they selected and groomed their victims, and how to recognize early warning signs of manipulative behavior. Understanding how they operated, she said, isn't about becoming paranoid or closed off from relationships. It's about developing sophisticated judgment skills that allow you to be open to genuine connections while protecting yourself from people who might want to exploit your trust. The recovery process also involved reconnecting with aspects of my life that had been stolen or distorted during my captivity. I had to relearn how to make decisions for myself, how to trust my own instincts, and how to build relationships based on genuine mutual respect rather than the careful performance I'd maintained while imprisoned. One of the most challenging aspects of recovery was dealing with the knowledge that Rebecca and Marcus had genuinely seemed to care about me, even while they were systematically destroying my life. The contradiction between their apparent affection and their willingness to imprison and exploit me was difficult to reconcile, and it made me question my ability to accurately judge other people's character and motivations. That contradiction is exactly what made their manipulations so effective, Dr. Warren explained. They weren't cartoon villains who were obviously evil. They were skilled manipulators who understood that the most effective way to control someone is to make them believe that the control is an expression of love and care. The therapy helped me understand that my trust in Rebecca and Marcus hadn't been a character flaw or a sign of poor judgment. They had specifically targeted me because I was a good person who was inclined to trust others and who wanted to believe the best about people I cared about. They had exploited virtues, not weaknesses. As my recovery progressed, I began to consider how I could use my experience to help other people avoid similar situations, or escape from them if they found themselves trapped. I started volunteering with organizations that provided support to missing persons families and that advocated for stronger protections for vulnerable adults. The volunteer work connected me with families who were searching for missing loved ones, some of whom had disappeared under circumstances similar to mine. I was able to help several families understand that their missing relatives might be victims of institutional fraud rather than voluntary disappearances, leading to investigations that resulted in additional rescues and arrests. "Your story gave us hope," one mother told me after we'd helped locate her missing daughter in a private facility 3 states away. "Everyone kept telling us that our daughter had probably left voluntarily because she was troubled, but you proved that troubled people are often the ones who need protection the most." The work was emotionally challenging but deeply meaningful, providing me with a sense of purpose that helped counteract the helplessness I'd felt during my captivity. Every person we helped locate, every family we reunited, felt like a victory against the type of evil that Rebecca and Marcus had represented. I also became involved in training law enforcement personnel to recognize signs of institutional fraud and to investigate missing person cases more thoroughly. Many police departments had treated disappearances of vulnerable adults as low-priority cases, assuming that people with mental health issues or financial problems had simply chosen to start over somewhere else. The assumption that troubled people disappear voluntarily, I told one group of detectives during a training session, is exactly what criminals like Rebecca and Marcus count on. They specifically target people whose disappearances won't be investigated aggressively, and they create cover stories that discourage family and friends from looking too hard. The training sessions often included role-playing exercises where officers practiced interviewing people who claimed to be receiving treatment for mental illness, learning to distinguish between genuine patients and people who might be held against their will. The exercises were based on scenarios from real cases, including details from my own experience that could help officers recognize when something wasn't right. Over time, I began to rebuild a social life and personal relationships, though the process was gradual and required constant attention to my own reactions and instincts. I had to learn to distinguish between normal relationship dynamics and patterns that might indicate manipulation or control. The first significant relationship I developed after my rescue was with David Chen, a victim advocate who worked with some of the same organizations where I volunteered. David had also survived institutional abuse, though his experience had been in a legitimate treatment facility where staff had exploited patients financially and sexually. Our shared understanding of systematic abuse created a foundation for trust that might have taken years to develop under normal circumstances. I think what drew me to David initially, I told Dr. Warren during one of our sessions, was that he understood the difference between care and control. He'd experienced both, and he could recognize when someone was trying to help versus when someone was trying to manipulate. The relationship with David progressed slowly, with both of us being extremely careful to maintain our individual autonomy and to avoid patterns that might resemble the controlling relationships we'd escaped from. We established clear boundaries, maintained separate living spaces, and regularly checked in with each other about our comfort levels and concerns. Healthy relationships after trauma, Dr. Warren explained, often require more conscious effort and communication than relationships between people who haven't experienced systematic abuse. But that extra attention can actually create stronger, more genuine connections, because both people are committed to respecting each other's autonomy and well-being. David and I eventually moved in together, but only after extensive discussions about how to maintain our individual identities and support systems while building a shared life. We established protocols for decision-making, conflict resolution, and personal space that ensured neither of us could accidentally recreate dynamics from our abusive experiences. The relationship became a model for how trauma survivors could build healthy partnerships without sacrificing their independence or safety. We eventually co-authored an article about relationship building after abuse that was published in a journal for mental health professionals, and that led to speaking engagements at conferences for trauma survivors. The goal isn't to never trust anyone again, David and I would tell audiences. The goal is to develop sophisticated trust that's based on consistent behavior over time, rather than initial impressions or emotional manipulation. My career also evolved significantly after my rescue. While I returned to healthcare, I shifted from clinical work to patient advocacy and healthcare fraud investigation. My experience with Rebecca and Marcus's manipulation of medical systems gave me unique insights into how healthcare could be corrupted for criminal purposes. Working with healthcare fraud investigators, I helped develop protocols for identifying medical professionals who might be involved in patient exploitation schemes. The protocols included background checks for employees with access to patient records, monitoring systems for unusual conservatorship applications, and training programs for healthcare workers to recognize signs of patient abuse. Healthcare fraud isn't just about billing irregularities, I would explain to investigators. It can involve systematic abuse of patient trust and exploitation of vulnerable people who are seeking help. Medical professionals have enormous power over patients, and the power can be used for criminal purposes by people who understand how to manipulate both patients and systems. The work led to several high-profile investigations and arrests, including cases involving nursing home operators who were drugging patients unnecessarily to make them easier to manage, and therapists who were manipulating vulnerable clients into signing over financial assets. Each case reinforced the importance of oversight and accountability in healthcare settings. As the 5th anniversary of my rescue approached, I reflected on how completely my life had been rebuilt and redirected by my experience with Rebecca and Marcus. While I would never choose to relive those months of captivity, I couldn't deny that they had ultimately led me to meaningful work, genuine relationships, and a deeper understanding of human nature than I might have achieved otherwise. Trauma doesn't have to define your entire life, Dr. Warren had told me early in my recovery, but it will probably influence the direction your life takes. The question is whether you can find ways to use that influence positively, to create meaning from suffering, and to help prevent others from experiencing similar harm. The meaning I'd created from my suffering was evident in the lives that had been saved, the policies that had been changed, and the relationships I'd built with other survivors. While the cost had been enormous, the outcomes had justified the struggle and provided me with a sense of purpose that was both deeply personal and broadly impactful. The criminal organization that had nearly destroyed my life was completely dismantled, with dozens of arrests and convictions that effectively ended their operations. The private facilities they'd operated were either closed permanently or transferred to legitimate operators with proper oversight. The victims who had been rescued were gradually rebuilding their lives with varying degrees of success. Rebecca and Marcus remained in federal prison, where they would spend many more years paying for their crimes. I occasionally received updates about their status from prosecutors, but I had no desire for direct contact or confrontation. They had taken enough of my life. I wasn't going to give them any more of my time or energy. The house where I'd been imprisoned was eventually demolished, with the land donated to a nonprofit organization that built a small community center for missing persons families. The center provided resources for families searching for loved ones and support groups for people whose relatives had been found, or who had accepted that they might never be found. Helen Reeves, the neighbor who had helped me reach safety, became like a grandmother to me, and we maintained regular contact throughout my recovery and beyond. She often said that helping me had been one of the most important things she'd ever done, but I knew that I owed her my life, and that her quick thinking and compassion had made all the difference in my survival. "I just did what anyone should do," Helen would say when people praised her for helping me. "When someone asks for help, you help them." It's not complicated. But Helen's response had been far from typical, and her willingness to immediately believe my story and take action had been crucial to exposing Rebecca and Marcus's crimes. Many people might have dismissed my claims as mental illness, or suggested I needed professional help rather than police intervention. Looking back on my entire experience, from the initial manipulation through the captivity and eventual rescue, to the long process of recovery and rebuilding, I understood that survival had required not just physical endurance, but mental resilience, emotional strength, and the courage to maintain faith in my own perceptions even when everyone around me insisted I was wrong. The skills I'd developed during those months of fighting for my sanity and freedom had served me well in the years that followed, helping me navigate challenges, build relationships, and pursue meaningful work with confidence and determination. While I wouldn't wish my experience on anyone, I also wouldn't trade the person I'd become as a result of surviving it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.